This episode has a little bit of something for everyone. If you are marketing a consumer brand, if you're a writer, if you are a publicist or PR professional, or if you just want a cocktail suggestion, this episode is for you. I talked to Aaron Goldfarb. He's a novelist, he's a cocktail writer and critic for Esquire, Food and Wine, and many other publications. And his upcoming book, Brand Mysticism, is co written with Steven Grasse, who's the marketing guru behind Hendrick's Gin and Sailor Jerry's Rum. So, as a little thought exercise, come up with the year that you think Hendrick's Gin first came to market and was sipped by people. The actual year will be revealed in the episode. We talked through a bunch of things like what makes a brand mysterious and what Aaron learned writing this book. We talk about getting novels published. Aaron's a journalist, and so we talk through the right and wrong ways to pitch a journalist your brand. And then finally, a few bourbon recommendations by a real connoisseur. Cheers.
Hi, Aaron. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Great. You have a book coming out in October, co-written with the so-called punk rock prince of small batch spirits. I need a frickin' nickname like that. About how he helped make booze brands cool, like Hendrick's Gin or Sailor Jerry Rum, ones that we've probably seen and think are cool. What's the book about, Aaron? What's it called, and what did you learn while writing it?
Yeah, you're talking about Steve Grasse. He's a really colorful guy. He's actually not that much older than me. He's in about his mid 50s. I'm in my early 40s, but he hit the ground running right out of college and launched his own ad agency in Philadelphia at the age of 23, I think. And his first decade, he was just trying to scrape together and get any clients he could. He was one of the first ad agencies to work with MTV. He was doing their bumpers and stuff. He, oddly enough, had R.J. Reynolds as a client, back in the days when you could promote cigarettes. So that taught him a lot of valuable lessons about marketing products that people literally hate, do not want you to market. But by the late 90s, he had discovered he had a real knack for marketing alcohol. He literally thinks it's one of the best products on planet Earth because, it's a mix of history and science. There can be great branding. Unlike fashion, it stays on the shelf for years. He'd also worked with Puma, and if shoes weren't cool after a week, they go in the landfill. But a great booze brand might exist for hundreds of years. So he was just doing ad work, marketing work for clients, and then he realized, the way to really make money is to create my own brands, to own my own brands. He came up with Hendrick's Gin with William Grant and Sons. He came up with Sailor Jerry Rum with William Grant and Sons. He literally came up with those two brands on the same day. So the book is really just part memoir of his punk rock life. He's a pretty soft spoken guy, actually. I don't think you'd consider him punk rock. He's a humble dad in Philadelphia these days. But he's had a very interesting life. He's got very contrarian ideas. He's very kind of anti the typical Harvard Business School thoughts on how to market and how to launch brands and whatnot. And so the book is kind of about that. If you're launching a booze brand, it'd be a great book for you to read. But I think he thinks, and I agree with him, the lessons would apply whether you're launching a cupcake brand or a T-shirt brand or a new whatever company. They apply across the board.
And the book, as I understand, it's called Brand Mysticism. And
Yeah.
why the word mysticism? I mean, I kind of get it because with a booze brand, there's some kind of mystique or maybe there's some reason why you want to choose this vodka over that vodka because what it might say about you as a consumer. I mean, am I kind of getting on target here, or is it something else?
Well, not quite. One of Steve's great theories is that the things in the world that really last have an inherent mysticism to them. He likes, for example, Lord of the Rings. You know, he thinks one reason Lord of the Rings is such something that, is still such a valuable property these days, probably what, however many years after J.R.R. Tolkien died, is because he built in such an underlying mysticism to it. He famously spent 20 years just plotting out what this imaginary world would look like before he ever wrote his first book. He literally created a fake language for the book. And Steve calls that the onion method, where, if you just want to read an interesting fantasy book, pick up Lord of the Rings and read it, and you might have a good time. But the real geeks, and this applies to Star Wars, Star Trek, The Simpsons, and he would say Hendrick's Gin too. If you really want to geek out about these things, if you really are the super fan for these things, you can keep peeling back layers of the onion and learning more and more about them. They're not just kind of facile things that just exist. And Steve believes a lot of the new brands launched today. He jokingly calls it the Brooklyn aesthetic, and I'm sitting here in Brooklyn. But these super hip hipster brands that have all the perfect lettering, all the beautiful design, everything in place is correct, everything's artisanally sourced or whatever. He feels a lot of those brands. You peel back layer one of just the design, the facade, and there's nothing underneath. Whereas he would say for Hendrix, he's created a whole brand world, where, if you just want to drink a good gin, that's fine. If you want to explore deeper and deeper into the mythology, into, anything about it, he thinks that's why it's really stuck and become one of the biggest brands today in booze.
And it's interesting because if you had asked me how old Hendrick's Gin was, I would have assumed it was around a lot longer than the 90s or the early aughts or whenever it was conceived. That's really interesting.
We actually have a line in the book. Steve says that's his favorite thing people say to him. He said people literally get in arguments with him. No, you didn't create that in 1999. It's been around for hundreds of years. And he thinks that's great. He wants to create things, and this again goes to how he creates his brand Mysticism, where you can't place, the time frame. There's nothing trendy. It's a mix of all these things from the past, kind of the artistry of Jules Verne from the 1880s. You have, the apothecary bottle they use is, I think, a 1700 style bottle. So it's all these mix and mashes of things from different eras. The commercials famously have those cutouts that kind of look a little Monty Python Flying Circus-esque from the 1960s. So a lot of people think the brand is older than 1999, but it's not.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And for a marketer who's, let's say, launching a consumer brand, or really any kind of brand, wanting to develop mysticism. I mean, maybe there's no such thing as a formula for mysticism, but is there any advice dispensed about how one wraps their head around this line of thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I can at least speak to kind of the formula he lays out in the book for alcohol brands, and again, you're right. It's kind of silly to think of a formula. There's a million ways to get things done. If you compare Hendrick's Gin to Sailor Jerry Rum, they're not very similar at all until you dig deeper. He thinks time is key. A lot of people launch something and then it doesn't work for the first month or the first year, and they give up on it. But he thinks a lot of these things, they do take time to catch on, whereas things that go instantly viral don't necessarily have legs after that initial virality. You do have to have a unique product, not necessarily a good product, he would say, maybe
Mm-hmm.
paraphrasing, but a unique product. I'm a big bourbon drinker, and it's just astonishing, all these indistinguishable new brands that are released. I just don't know what compels someone in 2021 Wait, is it 21? I don't even know
It's
what year it is
22.
anymore. 22. Right. Uh, to go, there's not enough bourbon on the market. I'm going to release a new bourbon. So how are you distinguishing yourself? Why would I pick that opposed to any of the other hundreds, if not thousands, of bourbons? So you need a distinguishing thing. And for Hendrix, the distinguishing characteristic was it was the first gin made with cucumbers, which was that might not sound odd today when so many craft products are made with weird things. That was a very weird thing back then to have a cucumber flavored gin. And that's what distinguished it early on. It was also in the dark apothecary bottle, as I
Hmm.
mentioned. Most of the classic gins of that time were in just the standard clear bottle. Doesn't mean it's better if it's in the dark thing. Doesn't mean it's better if it's a cucumber gin. But at least you're starting from a place where you have an angle to market with. Try the world's first cucumber gin.
Hmm.
Oh, what's that weird apothecary bottle on the shelves? So he would say that's one of the key things for whatever you're doing. You have to distinguish yourself.
So I want to keep talking about cocktails, but I want to pause for a second because you mentioned something about J.R.R. Tolkien taking 20 years to invent a language or plot out the book or whatever. Aaron, I think a lot of us, myself included, think we have a book in us, and I haven't written a book, yet. I'm gonna don't write the next great American novel, um, but you're a published author novel and this new collaboration. Um, what's it like? I'm not necessarily asking about the process of writing a book, but what's the process of marketing yourself as an author? How do you do that, and what has been your success and challenges along the way?
I mean, there's a real difference between marketing a novel and marketing, like this new book that's coming out. No one really needs a novel, so it's hard to to market something that someone is buying out of pure pleasure or
Hmm.
inspiration or whatever. And novels do not sell very well at all. Aside from a few, kind of pulpy paperback novelists, most people do not sell a lot of novels, even names you've probably heard of, and there's not a lot of famous novelists anymore. It's very hard to sell a novel. Maybe why I haven't written one in about 6 or 7 years. Whereas, a book like Steve's, if you're listening to us right now and you just heard what I've been saying for the last 10 minutes, you've either said in your head, "Oh, that sounds like something I need," or you've said, "Okay, that doesn't apply to me at all." If I tell you I've written a novel about this guy who does this and does this, you might say, "Well, that sounds interesting," but it's really hard to compel someone to instantly hear about the plot of a novel and then go online and buy it. It really takes a lot of like constant pushing it. I believe, and I certainly don't think I ever found the secret to marketing novels, and I think a lot of people have not found the secret. Most publishers haven't, and that's why so many novels don't get bought and read. It's a very tough thing to market these days.
Well, what's the literal pitch process these days? Because I guess I asked the question kind of, I was talking about like once a novel is released, how is it marketed? But also,
Uh,
what's the process of pitching a publisher to back you as a writer and to back the novel?
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways books are sold these days to publishers, of course. Novels, still, for better or worse, you write the whole thing. You
Hmm.
know, if you're Stephen King, I'm sure you have a deal for your next 5 or 10 books. But most people, you know, they have to write the whole thing, or at least a massive chunk of it before they're going to get any cash. And if it takes you 5 years to write your great American novel, those are going to be some potentially lean years where you're not making any money. Now, for other books, for something like Brand Mysticism, for a cocktail book I've written, you can literally sell that with a text or an email. I have a friend, Robert Simonson, who's a great cocktail writer, and he thought the world was ready for a new martini book. There hadn't been a great martini book in like 20 years. Yeah, he texted a publisher he was friendly with, from what I understand, from what he told me. Hey, I think I'd like to write a martini book. That was enough to sell it based on his success as a New York Times cocktail writer and on the idea. For this book with Steve and I think we put together a 10 to 15 page proposal and sent it out to 20 25 publishers and took bids. The dream is that all 25 bid, but that rarely happens. Um, so for the nonfiction books, you're going to typically put together a proposal of any size. You can do whatever you think is going to best lead to getting it sold. Which, if you're Robert, might be a text. If you're us, was a 10 to 15 page proposal.
Hmm. Neat. Yeah. And I think what I'm gleaning from this is if you're going to write the great American novel, it better be a passion project. Um,
Absolutely.
Better be a passion project. I want to get back to cocktails for a moment. Would you mind describing to the listeners your writing about cocktails? And I want to ask you some questions as a PR professional.
Yeah, well, my success or lack of success as a novelist kind of led to alcohol writing. I never wanted to be a cocktail writer. I enjoyed drinking cocktails. I enjoyed drinking craft beer and whiskey and whatnot, as most writers do. Um, and my first novel came out, and I got a little attention from it, and I had a connection with Esquire and a editor there. We were just chatting. He wanted me to write something for them, and I just so happened to know a lot about craft beer and whiskey, and he didn't really have anyone at the time that could write about that. Men's magazines love alcohol writing,
Hmm.
always have. So he hired me to write a few stories, and I was like, wow, this is great. I'm going to be drinking cocktails and going to bars anyways, and now if the writing about it can subsidize it, even better. It's something I've been doing for the last decade. It's a nice day job. It's better than being a professor, in my opinion, which a lot of authors are in their day job. And it's, to me, endlessly fascinating. So many stories can be alcohol stories, can be booze stories. It really encompasses, you know, everything. I mean, I met Steve because of my career, and I never planned to write a business or marketing book. And,
Hmm.
now I just wrote that with Steve because of my alcohol journalism.
Well, I want to ask for some recommendations a little bit later
Sure.
on, and maybe some emerging trends. But before I do, when we were talking off air, I wanted to explore um, the right way to pitch journalists. So I'm a marketer, a B2B marketer. But if you're a B2C marketer, really anyone, you might be trying to get a reporter or journalist who's who's covering your beat to pay attention to your brand. And I'd love for you to dispense some advice around if if a brand's looking to reach out to you, Aaron, or one of your colleagues about something else, what's the right way to do it? What's the wrong way to do it? What are the rules of engagement for interacting with journalists these days, in your opinion?
Yeah, and I think I have an interesting perspective because I'm pitched literally every day by brands. But then when I have a book out, you know, I'm forced to at least dialogue with my publicist about pitching sometimes these same writers. So
Right.
I think I have some decent insight. Obviously, personalization is always better. If you get a blast that clearly went to 1,000 journalists about a new product or whatnot, that's not necessarily going to be that exciting. I get it. You know, if Pappy Van Winkle has an exciting new release, it might just be easier to blast it to 1,000 people. So personalization, I've always liked publicists that kind of come up with a potential story idea. And sometimes people don't know what the best story about their product is. They kind of think they'll pitch me on something they think's the interesting thing about their product, and deep in the press release or whatever, I notice something. I think, oh, actually, that's the interesting thing about your product. Um, Other times, I would really say you have no chance. if you're a publicist for a toilet paper brand, how the hell do you pitch that to anyone? I mean, you know, if you're a publicist for an exciting new 25-year-old single malt scotch, well, that's probably easier to pitch to people to get them to write about. So there's only so much you can do based on what you're selling. If your product's inherently exciting, it's going to be a lot easier, and you're going to have a lot more latitude for, sending out bad pitches just because the product's so exciting. Um, I think a lot of people bog down writers with just way too much information. Like, I think really effective pitches are just like, here's a few sentences on why I think this is intriguing to you, and what you can maybe do with it. Um, that's always worked for me.
I I think that's worked for me too. I also, to the extent for personalization, I know if you're trying to pitch me as a CMO, like a marketing product, um, knowing a little bit about me, or really personalizing a message authentically, will is
Yeah.
much more likely I'm going to read it. Not necessarily more likely I'm going to respond, but I will read it. But I also prefer something simple, like when we were launching this podcast. I think I got an inbound request saying, "Do you do you want to produce a B2B? You don't want help producing a B2B podcast?" And I think it was short and sweet. And I was like, "Thank you. Yes, that's exactly what I need." I didn't need a whole
Yeah.
bunch of data. I didn't need 40 paragraphs. So yeah, I definitely think that's good advice. What do you think about like the the ratings and reviews world as it pertains to spirits, beer, and that sort of thing? I ask folks from all types of industries, because we're very review and ratings focused, I think, as
Yeah.
marketers, if not consumers also.
I like it. I was a kid who grew up loving to read criticism. I was a film buff growing up, and I still am. I actually went to film school. I love to read film criticism before I watched a movie, after I watched a movie, assess whether I agree with what the critics say, don't agree. Um, so I like it. And there's not as much kind of ratings and reviews and criticism of spirits as there used to be. I think we've gotten into a world where criticism is kind of seen as nasty. A lot of the big brands are not, quite frankly, mature enough to accept a, a bad review of something, and they need to be. You don't see a lot of you know film directors or actors get furious if Roger Ebert gave him a bad review, or the New York Times gave him a bad review. They know that's part of the game, and I think a lot of spirits companies have tried to make that not part of the game.
Mhm.
Um, and I think a lot of magazines and websites kind of want the faucet still turned on of advertising from these brands, of the samples from these brands, so they can do their job. So they kind of dance around really pointed criticism, but there's nothing wrong with criticism, and I wish we'd see more of that. When you really discover a great critic, a great reviewer of something, someone like this guy, this woman, you know, uh, if she likes something, I typically do. If he dislikes something, I typically don't. When you can really have someone lead you to what you should buy, especially something like spirits is expensive, you know, how do you make decisions without tasting it when bottles are so expensive? Well, if you have a good critic you trust, and it could be an amateur critic on YouTube or Instagram or whatnot, where you're likely to see more um, serious reviews, because they don't have to worry about advertising or anything. They're just dudes in their basement giving their pointed reviews. Those can sometimes be more helpful than a real professional magazine's review of a spirit.
Um, let me round out the questions here by asking for a couple of recommendations. What cocktails are you really excited about these days, and what's kind of hot if I want to go to a restaurant, and impress my friends with what I order?
Well, martinis are hot again. They always are, hot, then something only old people drink, then they become hot again. They're hot in all sorts of variations of martinis. Espresso martini, kind of had a thing again this winter. What else is hot? The Cosmos oddly made a comeback.
Those, I think those came out when I was in college. Or that's a '90s drink, right? Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Sex in the City and whatnot. That's kind of made a comeback. I think after being trapped at home for 2 years, people want kind of classy, expensive looking martinis and whatnot, which was something they were probably deprived of over the last 2 years. So you're seeing a lot of kind of elegant drinking these days, especially in New York. Even from 20 somethings, you wouldn't think have the money to go to a hotel bar and get a $25 martini, but it's a kind of affordable luxury to go get yourself a nice martini at a bar. So I'd say that's hot right now. Um, Amaro's hot if you know what that is. Bitter liqueurs. The most famous cocktail of that is a Negroni, which
Hmm.
is gin and Campari and vermouth. So kind of riffs on bitter cocktails are pretty hot and have been for the last few years. And whiskey's as hot as
Well,
ever. It's always
you
hot.
mentioned you're a bourbon aficionado, and you dropped Pappy Van Winkle as an, that's obviously very expensive and hard to get. If 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 a consumer or listener is thinking about a bourbon that you'd really recommend that won't cost them 100 or 200 bucks, what would you suggest they do? Whether they're in Brooklyn for a small batch, or something they can get on the national scene.
Yeah, I mean, I recommend this one all the time, and I used to worry that I would quit seeing it on the shelves because it's incredible, but for whatever reason, it remains very easy to find. It's called Old Forester 1920, about a $70 bottle. I think it stacks up with anything rare, anything extraordinarily expensive, anything quote unquote luxury. It's incredible stuff. You can find it just about any liquor store, especially big ones, any state. Great stuff. I'd also recommend Russell's Reserve. That's the high end line from Wild Turkey. About a $50 bottle. That really delivers as well.
And maybe this is heresy, but can you have a Manhattan with bourbon, or is it rye, or do you not even trifle with a Manhattan at those price points?
No, I'm not a huge Manhattan drinker. My wife is, so if I'm making her one, I make myself a second one just
Hmm.
because no need to get any more glasses dirty. But
Efficiency.
no, yeah, bourbon or rye is acceptable. I think rye is nice because sweet vermouth can be very cloying, so the rye kind of cuts down on the sweetness. But if you like sweetness, a bourbon Manhattan's perfectly delicious too.
Thanks, Aaron. It's still the afternoon, but I'm getting thirsty. Got to be honest with you.
Me
In,
too.
in the show notes, we'll put where to find you. But plug the book. When does it come out, and what's the title, and where can folks pre-order it?
Yeah, it's called Brand Mysticism. There's a super long subtitle I've already forgotten, and I'll need to remember for future interviews. Me and Steve Grasse, Grasse. It's everywhere better books are sold right now, and pre-orders always really help future bestseller lists and reorders. So if you're thinking about buying it, now is the time.
Right on. Thanks, Aaron. Really great to talk to you today.